Kibsi on the Zoud, or one of these kind of old traditional Yemeni songs, or you'd get Islamic nasheeds. And now you turn on Yemen FM 99.9, and you've got, DJ, what's his name? Forgotten his name, but it was a fantastic name. And I met this guy, and he didn't introduce himself by his real name, but by his DJ name, and what time he was on Fridays on Yemen FM. And he, so the radio channel itself is owned by Ahmed Ali Abdullah Saleh, but it's actually one of the most popular radio channels in Yemen because it has English and modern Arabic music, and so everyone, all the youth want to listen to that. And every time you go into a taxi, what's on? Yemen FM. Another one I'd like to mention because of one links to it, which is Dairamana FM, which is less well known, but I mentioned it because I briefly had a one episode radio show on there, where we did 2 hours of music and hard-hitting nonsense. And yeah, so Dairamana is all English, and that's you've got Yemenis, vast majority of who can't speak English, can't understand, and yet you go into those taxis and they're all listening to all the latest tracks that have come from the UK, and the phone-in shows are fantastic as well, because you have people who can't speak English very well calling up an English language phone-in show, and it's entertaining, let's put it that way. So that's an outline of the main private news organisations. Just to briefly mention the state of state TV, because that's also a reason why private TV is emerged so strongly. State TV is very confused about what its position is now on everything. State TV pre-2011 was completely backed the former president. State TV would always come out with statements about the great leader and our brother leader Ali Abdullah Saleh, various different things like that. And throughout 2011 was shockingly bad in its coverage of the revolution and the protests. Yet once Hadi came into power, State TV wasn't quite sure what to do anymore, and obviously they kind of back Hadi now, but it's toned down a lot. Actually, well, even now with Houthi takeover in Sana'a, they're totally confused. And they showed a southern Iraq demonstration on TV the other day. One of the demonstrations calling for independence was broadcast or showed on the news, which is hasn't happened before. It is in the way it was presented, and shows you the confusion of state TV and the Ministry of Information. Talk a bit about the journalism itself in the private media. For me, there are positives and negatives. With regards to positives first, there's some quality journalism being produced. There was a case of a guy called Mohammed Al-Absi, who was a journalist, a TV reporter at Azad TV, and he did a fantastic documentary that was locally made, produced, and broadcast on Azad about kidnapping in Yemen and the kidnapping of foreigners, which is something that's a really big problem in Yemen, and something that he put across in a very enlightened manner and a way that affected and struck a nerve with many Yemenis. And he called it I Have a Hostage, and they interviewed, it was the case of the South African gentleman who is still in Yemen as a hostage, and they broadcast his wife and his kids, trying to plead with the kidnappers, and a lot of Yemenis trying to say that this isn't us, and that we're totally against it, and trying to plead to the kidnappers that what you're doing is wrong. And there's also the sharp criticism, which I've mentioned already, and I think is a massive positive when I see, for example, the Minister of Electricity, or the old Minister of Electricity, Salah Sumayt. Now, one of the main issues I faced when I was in Yemen was hours and hours and hours of electricity cuts and blackouts, and that was in Sana'a. So I can't imagine what it was like in Aden and Hodeidah and the really hot cities, where they must have really struggled with the heat. And so, the Ministry of Electricity, despite him not being the sole person responsible for the problem, was obviously not doing his job particularly well. And so one of the newspapers called him the Prince of Darkness. And that stuck. It was, that Salah Shamahi became Amir al-Dhalam, and became the Prince of Darkness. It's quite fantastic. Now, let's talk a bit about the negatives. And for me, there are a lot of unfortunate negatives with and problems with the Yemeni media and the way journalism is conducted in Yemen. So, despite the emergence of a quasi-free press, or the emergence, of more private outlets and journalists being able to express their views, perhaps more than they did in the past, professionalism and neutrality are both lacking hugely in Yemen. It's not to say that journalism in the West or anything like that is completely professional, completely neutral. You open a copy of certain tabloid newspapers in the UK and you'll see examples of terrible journalism. But in a situation, in Yemen, where there are so many different problems and so many things that really only need a spark to set them alight, you're playing with fire with a lot of what these guys are spreading and disseminating. And what they, a lot of the time, it's not simply them trying to chase a good story. It's them being told they've got to cover a certain story by their owner or the owner of the newspaper or the television channel. And as an example, you've got the issue of sectarianism in Yemen, which for me is one of the main issues Yemen faces, and it didn't exist in the past to a certain degree, but now you have certain newspapers, certain websites talking about insinuating stuff about other sects. This stuff then gets spread around the internet. People, share stuff that they think backs their opinion, and it just breeds animosity. It breeds hatred, and we're seeing that now. We're seeing that right now in Yemen, and we're seeing groups like Al Qaeda try and take advantage of this hatred and this animosity that's now breeding. And there's other things as well. I mean, I spoke about kidnapping before, and an example of a journalist who was presented something quite positive and a really well done documentary. Yeah, I met another journalist who his speciality was kidnapping, and what he would do was essentially go. He had contacts with all the kidnappers, and he'd always get the first interview, and he'd roll down to wherever they were being kept. Outside Sana'a usually, and he couldn't speak English, so what he'd have would be a pre-prepared list of questions, like a questionnaire that in English that he'd genuinely get the hostages to fill out, that would say stuff, how do you feel, why did you get kidnapped, what happened, any messages you'd like to send to your family, and that was this guy's job, and he didn't see anything, particularly wrong with kind of leeching on, these hostages and taking advantage of the situation, and also probably had a lot of information that he didn't reveal to anyone. And like I said, in general, the affiliation of individual journalists with political figures and political movements means that a lot of the time, when they do come out with something that is true, the person from the other side simply will regard it as false, and it's a problem for their own integrity and the way their work's seen and how it's taken, if it's taken seriously or not. Talk a bit about the past. Private media isn't anything new in Yemen, and when I was researching this talk, I was watching a TEDx talk, TEDx Sana'a talk, which I recommend you guys to watch. It's by Saman al-Hamdani, and it's called "Fixing the Journalism in Crisis." And despite what you think about TEDx Sana'a I mean, I think right now actually they've got a TEDx Babel Yemen going on despite everything that's going on in Yemen. You've got a pile of guys who are in some conference room somewhere in Sana'a doing TEDx talks. And yeah, she mentioned a newspaper called El Fanus. And they had a headline on October 13th, 1935, so a very long time ago. And the editor was a guy called Abdullah Abdul Wahab Nu'man, and it's just 5 years after an attempted coup in North Yemen. And the headline, and I'm going to say it in Arabic, was "Inqilab Askari bi'ayn fil Yemen." I'm hoping this joke comes across to non-Arabic speakers. But basically, the word coup in Arabic, inqilab, also can kind of, it's the same way in terms of revolution in Arabic, in English, has kind of another meaning in terms of something revolving or flipping over. It's the same idea. So it's like a coup in Arabic also means, I guess, to flip over. Yeah, inqilab. And so, yeah, everyone rushed out to buy this newspaper with the headline that there'd been a military coup. And the actual story was a soldier had fell off a donkey. And so there was, so yeah, that was their headline. But it's just an example of satire and the use of satire in journalism. And this, we're talking about 1935, so everyone's talking about John Stewart and Bassem Youssef who had in Egypt. This has existed for a long time in the Arab world, I'm sure, and specifically in Yemen. And it's inspired others. So the work of satirists has inspired people like Mohammed al-Rura, I think his name is, who is a presenter on Sohail TV, who emerged in 2011, a bit like Bassem Youssef in Egypt, emerged in 2011 as a satirist, kind of attacking the government, but in a quite funny way. And he's become quite a big star in Yemen, and it's political as well. It's not just comedy. So yeah, he's presented himself as this comedian, but then he talks about political issues and political affairs. And it's also, you've got YouTubers now as well who are doing exactly the same thing. Young guys in Yemen online are producing really well-made videos that again attack the centers of power. And that's something that's seen in Yemen and seen across the Arab world, even in Saudi Arabia. Actually, one point about Saudi Arabia, there was a show in Saudi Arabia by a guy called Omar Hassan called Al-Tayr, and Omar Hassan, who is of Yemeni origin, that's why I'm linking it to this, was very popular, very funny guy, but he used to criticize the ministers and the government a lot, and eventually the advertisers pulled out of the YouTube show, and he did his last show basically saying, I'm not going to be simply a tool to brainwash others, and quit the show. And that's in Saudi Arabia. Yet next door in Yemen, you have YouTube stars who are able to criticize the government